She stepped onto the plane with a kind of stillness that made people turn without knowing why her shoes moved, but her body seemed to carry something heavier than luggage, something that could not be placed in the overhead bin, something that lingered in the air long after she passed. Her baby was wrapped tightly in a pale blue blanket, the kind hospitals give out for free, thin and already worn around the edges. She held him close to her chest, not as if to comfort him, but as if holding on to the only thing that kept her rooted to the earth. The boarding line moved around her, but she paused for a moment and looked down at the boarding pass, then at the rows of seats ahead, like she was making a decision she did not want to make, but would follow through anyway because it was the only option left. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning every face, not as if she was looking for someone, but maybe remembering someone, or hoping not to see them, a subtle kind of fear that made her steps quieter than most, as though she were trying to pass through the cabin unnoticed. The flight attendant at the back of the plane noticed her right away, not because of the baby or the way she walked, but because of the silence around her, like she had brought it with her, like she had been living inside it for a long time. She smiled at the woman, gently asked if she needed help with her bag, but the woman shook her head, eyes avoiding contact. Voice locked somewhere deep inside. She slid into seat 32, at the very last row against the window, the safest place for someone who did not want to be seen. The plane continued boarding, families, couples, tired businessmen, all moving past her with their phones and carry-ons and chatter, but she sat still like a photograph, unchanging, while the baby slept peacefully against her chest, unaware of the story that was unfolding without his permission. The flight attendant glanced back, once more watching the way the woman never loosened her grip, never looked up, never even took out her phone, just stared at the small hand pressed to her heart, as if that touch was the only thing reminding her she was still alive. Outside, the sun was beginning to drop below the horizon, casting soft gold light through the cabin windows. It hit her face, just enough to reveal what she had tried to hide. Her eyes were red, swollen, tired, but not from lack of sleep, not entirely. Somewhere behind that exhaustion was grief, not loud or sharp, but the quiet kind, the kind that settles in your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it should be, the kind that never really leaves you. The engines began to hum and passengers settled into their seats. The usual announcements played overhead, but in seat 32, and none of it seemed to matter. The woman reached into her diaper bag, pulled out a small folded envelope, stared at it for a long time before tucking it back in without opening it. She was waiting not for the flight to begin, but for it to end, waiting for something on the other side, something she had carried across oceans and months, and fears something that would either bring peace or break her again. And yet in that moment she looked almost calm, not because she was at peace, but because she had already survived the worst part of the story, or so she thought. The flight attendant noticed the woman again, this time more closely. She was sitting still, so still, almost too still for someone with a baby. She had seen new mothers before. The nervous energy, the constant shifting, the way their hands always reached out to check if everything was in place. But not her. She was motionless, eyes staring blankly ahead, as though she were already miles away. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the woman, slowly, gently placed a hand on the armrest, and asked if she needed anything, a drink, maybe a pillow for the baby. But the woman didn't move, not a glance, not a word. She kept her eyes locked straight ahead, and for a second the attendant thought she hadn't heard. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine." It was the way she said it, though, the tone empty, almost hollow, that made the flight attendant hesitate. It wasn't the voice of someone who was fine. It was the voice of someone who had stopped caring about being fine a long time ago. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The woman's hand remained clutching the baby's blanket, her fingers white against the soft fabric, her knuckles trembling just slightly, and then, in a sudden motion, the woman wiped at her face quickly as though she were trying to hide something, a single tear that had fallen unnoticed, but the flight attendant had seen it. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at the woman with a soft expression, one of understanding maybe, because she had seen the same pain before, or maybe because she could sense it in the air around her, a kind of silent grief that had been carried for far too long. The flight attendant reached for a small tray of snacks, offered it to the woman with a quiet smile, but the woman shook her head once again, her hand still tightly gripping the baby the same way she had when she boarded, as if that small child were the only thing anchoring her to this moment. A low murmur passed through the cabin as the plane began to climb higher, the lights outside dimming, as the sun disappeared, the gentle hum of the engines, a constant presence in the background. But none of it seemed to matter to the woman, who remained frozen in place, eyes distant, lost in thoughts only she understood. She glanced down at the baby for a moment, the slightest change in her expression, something like sorrow mixed with tenderness, and then the moment passed as quickly as it had come. The flight attendant moved away slowly, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was being hidden, something deep and painful, locked away behind those eyes and that stillness. A few rows up a child was laughing, the sound bright and carefree, but it felt out of place, too innocent, too loud against the quiet of the woman in 32. The laughter only made the silence around the woman feel even more suffocating. And that's when the flight attendant saw it again, the faintest tremor in the woman's hand, as she reached for the envelope again, the one she had tucked away earlier this time. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers, unsteady, the paper crinkling softly, as she stared at it with a look that seemed to stretch the seconds longer than they should have been. The flight attendant caught a glimpse of the paper, the corner of a name peeking out from the folds, the name of a man she did not recognize, but something about it made her pause, something that made her feel like she had just seen something she shouldn't have. She was about to ask the woman about it when a sudden movement caught her off guard. The woman quickly folded the paper back up and tucked it away once more, her face now flushed a deep red, but her eyes locked firmly on the seat in front of her, refusing to look up. The flight attendant stood there for a moment longer, her heart racing, just a little unsure of what to do next, or what to say. The air felt heavier, now thicker, as though the woman's silence had somehow pulled the tension from the cabin and wrapped it around them both. But she didn't say anything. She simply nodded and walked away quietly, leaving the woman in 32A to her thoughts, her grief, and the secrets she was still hiding. As the minutes ticked by the cabin, grew quieter the hum of the engines, becoming a background melody to the thoughts swirling inside the woman's mind. Her fingers continued to fidget with the envelope, as though it were the only thing left in the world she could control, but even that was slipping through her fingers. She glanced out the window, once more the sky now a deep shade of blue, the sun completely gone, leaving only the soft glow of the cabin lights to cast shadows on her face. She looked so far away, so unreachable, as if she didn't belong here among these strangers, sitting on a plane thousands of feet above the earth. Her hand tightened around the envelope again. She couldn't bring herself to open it. She had been staring at it for so long, the paper now wrinkled from her grip. But she couldn't bring herself to unfold it just yet. Something in her held her back, something deep inside told her that once she opened it she could never go back. She knew what was inside. She had read it 100 times, but it didn't matter how many times she read it. The words always felt like they were meant for someone else, someone who had already made peace with the past. But not her. She wasn't ready, not yet. The baby stirred in her arms. She looked down at him, his small hand moving slightly against her chest, as if he were searching for something that wasn't there, his breathing soft and steady. But the woman felt the weight of his presence, like it was too much to bear, like it was something she didn't deserve. She took a slow breath, and ran her fingers through his soft hair, her mind racing back to the day she had first received this letter, the day everything had changed, the day her world had shattered. And somehow she had ended up here, far from home, alone, in a seat at the back of a plane with nothing but the memory of a love that had been lost. The flight attendant passed by again this time, pausing just long enough to glance at the woman. But she didn't make eye contact, she didn't speak, she simply continued on her way, as though the woman in 32A was just another passenger, nothing more, nothing less. But the woman wasn't just another passenger. She was carrying the weight of something that no one could see, a burden that she had carried alone for so long it had become part of her, the kind of grief that doesn't scream or shout, but quietly consumes every moment until there's nothing left but silence. She closed her eyes for a moment, the letter still clutched tightly in her hands. She could feel the tears starting to burn at the edges of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall, not yet. She couldn't let them fall, because if she did, she knew it would mean the end of everything, the end of the story she had been writing for so long. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the woman exhaled slowly and slid the envelope back into her bag. She didn't look around, she didn't glance at anyone else. She just closed her eyes and let the weight of the moment settle over her. It wasn't until the plane hit a slight turbulence that the woman's hand flew to the baby, her grip tightening in an instinctive reaction. As the plane swayed slightly, she held him closer, like something deep inside her knew she couldn't afford to lose him too. She couldn't afford to lose anyone else. The flight attendant turned to check on her once more, but this time something had changed. She could see the woman's face a little clearer now, no longer hidden behind the veil of stillness. There was a crack in her composure, a small sign of the storm that had been brewing just beneath the surface. The flight attendant took a small step closer, her voice soft and unsure, but filled with the same warmth she had offered earlier. "Are you sure you're okay?" The woman looked up finally, her eyes meeting the attendant's for the first time, and in that moment the flight attendant could see it, the flicker of something raw, something that hadn't been seen in a long time, something that wasn't just sadness, but something deeper, something that held secrets yet to be told. She didn't say anything more, just nodded and took a step back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed a small but important moment, something that would change everything for both of them, if only they both knew it yet. The plane leveled out after the turbulence, and the cabin fell into a strange kind of quiet, the kind that only comes when everyone is lost in their own thoughts. Not a single voice raised the soft hum of the engines, the only sound in the background. The woman in 32, still hadn't looked up, her face hidden in shadow now. Her fingers traced the folds of the envelope once more, as though searching for something she couldn't find, something that wasn't there. But she couldn't stop herself. The motion was automatic, like breathing, something she did without thinking. But it was also her way of grounding herself, keeping her tethered to the present. Because if she didn't do something she feared, she would float away somewhere far from here, far from the truth. Her eyes flickered to the baby's face once more, his soft breath a reminder that he was there, he was real, he was the only thing that was keeping her from shattering into 1,000 pieces. And still she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she had to face, something she wasn't ready to confront. The flight attendant glanced at her once more, this time from across the aisle. She could see the woman's jaw set tight, her shoulders rigid, as though she were carrying a weight much heavier than a baby. The attendant didn't know what it was, but she could feel the gravity of it pressing down on the woman's chest, like a storm that had been gathering for years. She hesitated, but then made her way over to her again, her footsteps soft against the carpeted floor, the kind of steps that said she wasn't intruding, but just offering a moment of kindness, a moment of quiet support that perhaps the woman wasn't asking for but needed all the same. She stopped just short of her seat, but didn't sit down this time. She stood beside her, just out of arm's reach, her voice softer than before. "How's the baby doing?" The woman looked up then, her eyes meeting the attendant's for the first time since the flight began. Her gaze was distant, but not cold. There was a warmth there hidden beneath the sorrow that the flight attendant couldn't quite place. "He's fine," she said, her voice barely audible, her hand resting protectively against the baby's blanket. "He's fine." The flight attendant smiled gently, but there was something in her gut that told her this wasn't the whole story. This wasn't just a mother traveling with her child. There was something more, something unspoken lingering between them. She glanced down at the envelope again, watching the way the woman held it, as if it was her last connection to something she had lost. And then, without thinking, she spoke again. "What's his name?" The woman froze, her eyes flicking quickly to the envelope in her hands, as if she hadn't heard the question. But the flight attendant could see the tension ripple through her, the way her fingers tightened around the paper, like she was fighting the urge to pull it away to protect it from prying eyes. She didn't respond immediately, and for a moment the attendant thought she might not answer at all. But then the woman's lips parted, and the name came out in a whisper, a name that didn't fit the moment, it didn't fit the flight, didn't fit the woman who sat before her, but it fit her heart in a way that couldn't be denied. It was a name she hadn't heard in years, a name she had almost forgotten in the rush of time and grief. But now it was spoken aloud, and it changed everything. The flight attendant's stomach twisted as the name settled in the air between them like a ghost that had just walked into the room. Her heart skipped a beat as the name hit her ears. It was her brother's name, the name she hadn't spoken since the day he died 5 years ago, the name she thought she would never hear again, the name that had been buried under layers of loss and silence for so long. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The woman in 32, I didn't seem to notice her reaction. She was still staring at the baby in her arms, her hand moving slowly over his blanket, but the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that something had just been set in motion, something that neither of them could stop. She didn't know what to say next. She didn't know what to do with the truth that had just spilled into the open, so instead she stepped back just a little, her heart pounding in her chest as the weight of the moment settled between them, neither of them knowing how it would change everything that was about to happen. The flight attendant stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding against her chest, her mind racing with questions. But she said nothing. The name still echoed in her ears, and she tried to keep her face calm, but inside a storm was brewing. The woman in 32, I didn't seem to notice the change, her hand still resting on the baby's blanket, her fingers gently stroking the soft fabric, as if she were searching for something that was no longer there, or maybe never had been. She hadn't meant to say it, not out loud, not to someone else, not to anyone who could hear, but somehow the name had slipped out of her mouth like a confession, a secret long buried, but suddenly too heavy to keep locked away anymore. The flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had seen grief before she had seen it in so many faces in her years of flying, but this was different. It was deeper, darker, almost suffocating. And the woman in 32, wasn't just carrying the weight of a loss. She was carrying something more, something that had yet to be uncovered. She stepped back, but couldn't take her eyes off the woman. She wanted to ask her so many questions. But there was something holding her back, a sense that whatever had brought this woman here was something she had to discover on her own, a journey she was still in the middle of. The baby stirred again, and the woman gently lifted him in her arms, her eyes softening as she looked down at him, a flicker of tenderness crossing her face for just a moment, but it was quickly replaced by the same mask of silence, the same emptiness that had been there since the moment she stepped onto the plane. The flight attendant watched her for a moment longer, then turned to walk down the aisle, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in 32 wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't just someone passing through her flight. She was carrying a story, one that no one else knew, but that everyone could feel in the air around them. She passed the rows of seats, but couldn't stop glancing back at the woman, her mind swirling with thoughts and questions that she couldn't answer, not yet. But then something happened. The woman's hand slipped into her bag again, And this time when she pulled out the envelope, the flight attendant saw it clearly, the way her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, her face contorting in a way that made the flight attendant's heart skip a beat. She hadn't meant to look, but she couldn't stop herself. Her eyes followed the woman's movements as the letter opened piece by piece, revealing the name once more. But this time the flight attendant saw it more clearly, the full name, not just her brother's first name, but the last name too, the one that had always been too painful to speak, the one that had haunted her for years. It was her brother's name, but it wasn't just his, it was the name that had once been shared by someone else, someone she hadn't seen in years, someone who had vanished from her life before she even knew the full story, someone who had left a trail of questions that had never been answered. The woman in 32 closed the letter and tucked it away once more, but the damage had already been done. The flight attendant could feel it deep in her gut. Something had shifted in that moment, and she wasn't sure if it was the woman or herself that had changed. She turned away and walked down the aisle, but her mind stayed with the woman in 32, as she could still hear that name ringing in her ears like a bell tolling in the distance, warning her that something was coming, something was going to change in ways no one could have predicted. As the plane soared higher into the night sky, the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that this flight wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about something far bigger, something far more complicated than anyone had realized. And for the woman in 32, this flight would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one that would bring her face to face with a past she had tried to forget, and a future she couldn't yet understand. The air inside the cabin grew warmer as the flight continued on its steady course toward the unknown. The woman in 32 had stopped moving now, her hand no longer fiddling with the envelope, her fingers resting lightly against the baby's blanket, her eyes staring straight ahead, but not really seeing anything. The flight attendant had returned to her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to that moment. The name, the connection, she couldn't shake it. Something about it felt like a warning. But what was she being warned about? She had no answers, only questions swirling in her head. She tried to focus on her work, checking seatbelts, making sure passengers were comfortable. But every few moments her gaze would flicker back to the woman in the last row, the woman who seemed so out of place, so distant from the rest of the passengers. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how to help. How could she help when she didn't even understand what was happening? The name she had heard earlier echoed in her mind, a name that had changed everything in that brief moment, a name that linked her to the past in a way she hadn't expected. The last name, the one she had never said aloud, it had shaken her to the core. But now, as she walked through the aisles, she couldn't push it away, no matter how hard she tried. She looked down at her watch, and then out the window. The sky was a deep indigo, now the stars twinkling faintly on the horizon, but the flight still felt far from over. There was a tension in the air, a quiet unease, that she couldn't explain, a feeling that something was about to happen, something important, but she didn't know what or when. The woman in 32 was still sitting motionless, the baby still asleep in her arms. But her face had changed. There was something new there, something that had shifted when the name had been spoken, something she had been holding back for so long. And now the dam was close to breaking. The flight attendant couldn't ignore it any longer, the pull to understand, to uncover the truth, to figure out what was really going on inside that woman's heart and mind. She had seen enough to know there was more to this story than met the eye. But what was it? She paused in the aisle just a few feet from 32, her mind racing. She was drawn to her again, as if some invisible force was urging her to ask the questions that had been building inside of her since the moment the name had been spoken. She took a deep breath and walked over to the woman once more, this time not hesitating. This time she knew she had to do something. She had to try to connect. She stopped beside her seat and cleared her throat softly. The woman in 32 looked up at her slowly, her eyes a little less distant now, but still filled with something. The attendant couldn't name but recognized as the same kind of grief she had seen so many times before. The flight attendant opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, not yet, not, when the air between them felt so thick with unspoken things, so she just sat down in the empty seat next to her and waited. For a long time neither of them spoke. The only sounds in the cabin, the gentle hum of the engines and the soft breathing of the passengers. But then, without warning, the woman's voice broke the silence. It was barely a whisper, but it carried more weight than any shout could. "I never wanted this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to be here like this, to carry all of this inside me." The flight attendant didn't speak. She just listened, the weight of the woman's words hanging in the air. Between them, she could feel the tension easing just slightly, but it wasn't enough. The woman looked down at the baby in her arms, her fingers brushing the soft curls of his hair, before she continued, "I never wanted him to know the things I've been hiding, the things I've been running from. But I don't know how much longer I can keep running." The words hit the flight attendant like a punch to the gut. She felt the truth in them, even before the woman spoke the rest of it, the secrets, the pain, the things she had been carrying alone for so long. The baby stirred slightly, as if sensing the shift in the air, his small hand reaching out instinctively toward the woman, but she didn't move to comfort him, not yet, not, when the storm was still raging inside her. The flight attendant's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her. The woman in 32 egg was finally starting to unravel, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came spilling out. But the question was, would anyone be ready for it when it did? The flight attendant could feel the weight of the woman's words lingering in the air. She didn't know what to say next. The silence stretched on between them like an ocean, separating two people who had no idea how to cross it, the baby's small hand still outstretched toward her. But the woman didn't move to comfort him. Her eyes were distant, lost in something far away, something she was afraid to face. The flight attendant watched her for a moment, the quiet desperation in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as they held the baby, almost like she was afraid to let him go even for a second, as if doing so would unravel everything. The woman finally spoke again, her voice low, almost too soft to hear, but the words, they carried a weight that made the flight attendant's heart race. "I've been running from this my whole life," she said, her voice breaking just slightly, the tears threatening to spill, but she held them back like she had held everything back for so long, as if crying would be the final surrender, the final admission of defeat. The flight attendant swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. What could she say to make the woman feel like she wasn't alone in this moment, like there was some way out of this storm that had been raging for so long? She took a slow breath and leaned forward just slightly, her voice soft but steady. "If you need to talk, I'm here." The woman looked up, then her eyes meeting the flight attendant's for the first time, not with the blankness she had worn for most of the flight, but with something more real, something raw, something that made the flight attendant's stomach twist. The woman shook her head slowly, as if she were about to speak, but then stopped, as though the words were stuck deep inside her throat, unwilling to come out, unwilling to be set free. "I don't know if I can tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if I can say it out loud." The flight attendant didn't press her. She just waited, because she knew there was something more here, something that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long, and whatever it was finally coming to the surface. The cabin was silent now, the low hum of the engines filling the space between them, but the tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths and broken pieces that no one had been brave enough to pick up before. The baby stirred again, and the woman's attention shifted immediately, her hand going to him instinctively. As she cradled him close, her eyes softening as she looked down at his innocent face. But even in the gentleness of the moment, the flight attendant could see the conflict within her, the pain that still lingered just beneath the surface. The woman took a deep breath and looked at the flight attendant Once more this time there was something different in her eyes, something like a decision had been made, a choice to let go of the last piece of the wall she had built around herself. "I never wanted him to know what happened," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the words, "but I don't have a choice anymore. I can't keep running from it." The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. She could feel it then, the gravity of the moment. The truth that had been held back for so long was finally coming to light. And even though the woman hadn't said everything yet, the flight attendant could feel it in her bones. She knew that whatever came next, it would change everything. The woman's hands tightened around the baby, once more her grip protective, but uncertain. She looked down at him, as though he was her only anchor in this vast sea of uncertainty. And then she spoke the words that would break open everything. "I was never supposed to be his mother," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but the weight of it hit the flight attendant like a wave crashing over her. This wasn't just about grief. It was about something much deeper, something much darker. The baby's small hand reached up again, and the woman gently placed it in hers, her fingers brushing against his, but the flight attendant could see the walls inside her start to crack piece by piece as the truth spilled out into the air. The flight attendant didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond to a confession that was both heartbreaking and terrifying all at once. But she knew one thing for sure: the storm was only just beginning. The woman's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, her confession, a crack in the world she had carefully built around herself. The flight attendant didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond to something so raw, so painful, so completely unexpected. She only knew that the silence that followed was as heavy as the words that had just been spoken. The woman in 32 looked down at the baby in her arms, her fingers tightening around him protectively, like she was trying to hold on to something she feared would slip away. If she let go for even a second, the flight attendant could see the struggle in her eyes, the battle between the woman she was and the woman she had to be for him. "I wasn't supposed to be his mother," she said again, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "I never planned for any of this. I never wanted it, but somehow it happened, and now I don't know what to do anymore." The flight attendant felt her heart twist as the words echoed in her mind. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like to carry that kind of secret, to live with it for so long, to feel the weight of something so heavy every day of your life, and yet still try to keep it hidden from everyone around you. The baby stirred in her arms again, his tiny fingers reaching up, as if sensing the shift in the air, his small body moving restlessly, as if he could feel the tension that had built up between them. But the woman didn't move. She didn't react. She just sat there holding him close, like he was the only thing left that made sense in this world that was unraveling around her. The flight attendant could see the pain in the woman's eyes, but she also saw something else, something that gave her hope, a flicker of strength, a spark of determination. Even in the midst of all this chaos, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart, there was still something inside her that refused to give up. She didn't know what to say to make it better. She didn't know what words could possibly heal the wounds that had been left so deep. But she knew she had to try something. She had to say something that could make a difference, something that could offer her some kind of comfort. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We all have our own battles, but we don't have to face them by ourselves." The woman looked at her then, her eyes wide, as if she hadn't expected to hear those words, as if she hadn't expected someone to acknowledge the pain she had been carrying for so long. But in that moment, something shifted. A small crack appeared in the walls she had built around herself. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." The flight attendant felt a lump form in her throat. As she looked at the woman, she could see the fear, the uncertainty that she had been holding inside for so long, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the weight of it too, because she understood what it was like to feel lost, to feel like you didn't know how to move forward. But she also knew something else. She knew that no matter how dark the paths seemed, there was always a way forward. There was always hope, even when it didn't seem like it. "You don't have to fix everything," she said softly. "You just have to take it one step at a time, one moment at a time." The woman took a deep breath, and for the first time since the flight had begun, she let herself truly look at the flight attendant, her gaze softening just slightly, as if she were finally starting to let herself believe that there was a way through this, that maybe it wasn't all lost after all. And as the plane continued on its journey through the night sky, the flight attendant sat quietly beside her, the weight of the moment still heavy in the air. But now there was something else too, something that wasn't there before, a sense of understanding, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were both exactly where they needed to be in that moment. And as the baby settled back into her arms, the woman whispered softly to him a name that had once been buried under grief and shame. But now it was spoken aloud, and for the first time it felt like it belonged to them both. The flight attendant smiled gently as the plane carried them both through the sky. She didn't know what the future held for either of them, but she knew one thing for sure: they had both found a little bit of peace in the storm.